Welcome everyone to the latest session of Agenda 2025, FREOPP's conference on developing a domestic policy agenda for the president who's inaugurated in 2025 that ensures that every American has a fair shot at success. It's actually great to be with you today to talk about investing in underserved communities, especially because so much of the work that we do at FREOPP and the inspiration for the creation of FREOPP was Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp used to talk about what he called the American idea, that the Declaration of Independence applies to every individual, that everyone should have the same opportunity to rise as high as their talents and efforts can carry them, and that while people move ahead, we should endeavor to leave no one behind. And who better to help us talk about that and investing in underserved communities than Jimmy Kemp, the head of the Jack Kemp Foundation, who is with us today. Jack Kemp, along with establishing that beautiful articulation of the American idea, was really the brainchild behind what we now call opportunity zones. He often described it as enterprise zones when he was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and in other roles in Congress. So Jimmy is here to help us learn from that history and also in general what we can do to bring free enterprise to communities that haven't had enough of it. And we're also pleased to be joined by John Lettieri, whose organization, the Economic Innovation Group, which was founded by Sean Parker, the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, has been at the forefront of actually implementing and establishing opportunity zones and was very much behind that, inserting that provision into the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which has become such an important engine of private sector investment in our urban core. We're also joined by Patrick McKenna, who actually wears a lot of hats, but the way I can best describe him is he's a guy who has basically built a career starting companies that deploy the workforce that the venture capitalists and the hedge funders have been neglecting. 80% of all venture capital goes to 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. And Patrick has done very, very well taking advantage of the fact that the venture capitalists are ignoring the rest of the country. So he's going to talk about his experiences building those companies and what he's learned about investing in underserved communities. And Hadley Heath Manning, who's the policy director at the Independent Women's Forum, has done all sorts of interesting stuff, but today we're asking her to talk about a specific area where IWF has been very active, which is paid family leave. How do we ensure that working women have the same opportunities that we men have to participate in the dynamic and innovative economy? So with that, I'm going to start basically by asking each of you, the panelists, a question that delves into that background of each of you, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So if you've done one of these before, you know you can reach us for questions by either tweeting at us with the hashtag Agenda 2025 or by just clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window and entering a question in there. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we have time to do. So with that introduction, Jimmy, I'd love for you to take it away. You know, it must be so exciting to see this incredible explosion of investment based on something you've been working hard and your family's been working hard on for so long.
Well, thanks, Avik. It's great to be with you and to have this conversation. And I think it's important, yes, for 2025. Anytime you're exploring ideas and policies, it's critical to have a head start. And I applaud you. 2025, you've given us plenty of a head start.
That's the theory.
But I think really importantly, these are also issues that all of us care about, and we want to hold the feet to the fire of the incoming administration and those in Congress, and addressing how to best serve the underserved, or whatever description you want to have on folks who haven't been able to experience kind of the hope, the opportunity of the American dream, the American idea. That is something that my dad cared about deeply, and at the Jack Kemp Foundation and another organization I run called Empower America Project, that's really what drives us, is how to make the free enterprise system work for everybody. And what I wanted to do in my short kind of opening answer is give a quick background on enterprise zones, which, as you mentioned, morphed into opportunity zones, but also just the thinking, the philosophy behind it, and the intent. So the quick background is that in the 70s, we had stagflation, we had high interest rates and high unemployment. The tax code was onerous, And reforming the tax code was my dad's life mission as a congressman from Buffalo in the 70s and into the 80s. And in order to get the economy going, he understood that you could not tax behaviors that you wanted: investment, work, saving, and you couldn't subsidize behaviors you don't want: non-work, hiding from the government, whatever it would be. And so he wanted to reform the tax code, and his 1981 tax legislation, the Kemp-Roth tax bill, was the starting point. And then he started working on tax reform that actually came into existence in '86. But he took an idea from the UK, where poor communities, what we call distressed communities, industrial areas that did not have any economic growth, they had a policy called enterprise zones that zeroed out the capital gains tax for any investor who went into those areas. And my dad thought, well, we're trying to reach everyone with the hope and possibilities of entrepreneurial capitalism, small business entrepreneurial capitalism, and dealing with the issues that we have in our country then as now: race and other prejudices that exist. How can we get investment capital into those communities? And Dad just said, let's zero out the capital gains tax. And that idea was put into a draft, into a bill, into legislation. It's important to note that legislation never passed. Enterprise zones at the federal level never passed. There were state enterprise zones, but they became a tax credit program, and tax credits are different than zeroing out the capital gains tax, which was Kemp's idea. And Kemp's idea was to not have keep the government as little involved as possible. What morphed? You went enterprise zones, didn't pass into law. Bill Clinton introduced empowerment zones, a tax credit program, and those still exist today. They kind of morphed into new markets tax credits. And then Sean Parker, as you mentioned, and John Lettieri, and John gets much credit for this, not all of it certainly, but he did more than his fair share. And I was kind of a cheerleader on the sidelines. It's really incredible how they got opportunity zones passed into law. And it's not a tax credit program. It really is zeroing out the capital gains tax. But there is more, it's a little bit more complicated than Kemp's enterprise zones. But the intent behind it is what we're talking about. And it's one of many areas that need to be a part of this agenda for how to reach the underserved and help them experience the full promise and opportunity of the American idea and the American dream. So I'm glad you're focusing on it and glad to be a part of this.
Thanks, Jim. Well, John, he teed you up pretty well there. You want to take us to the present day. How's it going? There's been an explosion of interest. I get all these emails about new OZ funds that are out there. It's one of the hottest areas in investing today. Tell us about that and how it's living up to your expectations.
Sure. Thanks, Avik, for putting this together and for having us all to talk about this important topic. I think it's important to remember that even though the policy is approaching its third year into law, it is still a brand new marketplace. It took 2 full years for Treasury to write the regs. We didn't get final regs until the end of last year, end of 2019. And then a few months after that, we had a global pandemic that had some small effect on the economy and on capital markets. And so we haven't really hit the normal stride, what I'd consider the normal stride of the market, but we've seen a lot of growth and a lot of uptick in growth over the past year, in spite of all those factors that point to where the market could be going. And I think it's important to underscore that while this is new, this is also envisioned as a long-term policy. So the kind of challenges that opportunity zones were meant to address in part, they're not obviously not sufficient to do this, but the kind of challenges they were designed to help address are ones that took a long time to create. We don't have the potential for an overnight turnaround in most communities around the country. And so we have to calibrate expectations. It's a new market. It was envisioned as a long-term policy, and we're still very early in that timeline. In spite of those things, we've seen tens of billions of dollars of investment. So on the scale side, the market has certainly responded in an encouraging way. In terms of the diversity of places, one of the things that Congress really wanted to do with this was make it a malleable incentive that could be relevant across a wide array of types of communities. So urban, suburban, rural, post-industrial, the whole gamut of places that you could imagine. This was meant to be something that could be translated into a local context. And within a local context, it was meant to be applied across a range of needs. So not just housing, not just small businesses, not just one particular industry or another. And that's exactly what we see so far. We see a wide diversity of places receiving investment. We see a wide array of types of investment happening within communities, addressing a wide array of needs. But it's still
Can I stop you and just to explain for the audience that they may not be familiar, what qualifies as an opportunity zone? How is the law actually designed? What does it steer investment to?
So Congress set a national criteria. It set a baseline of, in general, you have to have at least a 20% poverty rate or higher, or your median income has to be 80% or lower than the area median income. These are the criteria that help you meet a low-income housing or a low-income community definition that was pre-existing that was kept by Treasury. So Treasury had that definition. Congress used that definition in defining the map of opportunity zones, but then it gave governors the responsibility to down select within their states a certain share of low-income communities as opportunity zones. So roughly 25% of nationwide communities that met that definition of low-income community were selected as an opportunity zone, which nets out to roughly 10% of the country's census tract. So it's a meaningful share of the country's population and geography. And within those communities, certain types of investment, Jimmy was making the point about the treatment of capital gains. That's the crux of the incentive, but not all investment qualifies. So there's often a lot of confusion that just because an investment happens within an opportunity zone that it's automatically getting the tax benefit. That's not the case. And in fact, most investors will have to wait 10 plus years before they see any really significant tax benefit, if ever, because these are equity investments and not a tax credit system, as Jimmy mentioned. You can lose money. Unlike with most other federal programs of this type, investment goes badly, you're actually going to be underwater. So it creates a kind of market discipline around this that has been missing from a lot of other programs, which I'm sure Patrick and others can speak to later in the program. So we're seeing a lot of good signs, but even though I've been deeply involved in this from the beginning, I'm often the first to say and the loudest to say it's too early to declare victory. It's also too early to declare defeat. And any kind of rush to conclusion about what this is or isn't going to be in the long term is premature at this point, given the scale of the task and how new this policy is.
There are
Last
some
question
good
for you.
signs, John.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, I was just going to say there are some good signs, right, John? I mean, there's some good things going on out there.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, the scale and diversity of what we're seeing is encouraging. The type of, especially when you see very intentional local efforts within communities where they've designated a coordinator to help recruit investment and marshal resources from the local community, engage with local community stakeholders. We often point to Erie, Pennsylvania as an example of where you really have transformative work being done even early in the process. But that's not just because of the tax incentive, it's because of the local leadership. And I think that's really how this is meant to work. Congress created a tool, but the craftspeople are local. And if they don't show up, then the policy is not going to be successful in any given place. When they do show up and you marry the tool with the local community, the results can be very powerful.
Before we move on to Patrick and Hadley, we actually have a question now that's relevant to this. So I want to ask it to you right now, John. It comes from Esther Dyson, who asks, so she says, so many of the projects, and this is the New York Times has written about this, appear like they're gentrification projects. I think of the Navy Wharf in DC, these nice hotels and the restaurants and things like that. Are those the kinds of investments that will lead to income growth and prosperity for the people who already live in those places? How much of this is just driving land values up for the people who happen to own lands and opportunity zones? Those are some of the criticisms that we've heard of OZs. Tell us about that, your response, your thoughts to that.
Sure. Well, to be clear, the Navy Wharf is not an opportunity zone, but there are places like that are. So I would caution folks that if what they know about the policy is mostly driven by the New York Times, they're going to be missing out on quite a bit of the reality of the policy. There's no doubt that governors, and Governor Cuomo is one of them, in some cases made some selections that don't make any sense to me. If you tally those up, the ones that are kind of the outliers that have driven a lot of the negative coverage that has been there, you get maybe 1 or 2% at most of the total picture of opportunity zones nationally. So a lot of what's happened is you've got this very coastal superstar metro narrative driving the conversation about what is fundamentally a picture of left behind America that doesn't bear any resemblance to concerns about gentrification or displacement, because we're talking about places that you're not putting luxury condos and all that goes with that in the Times coverage. These are places that are starved for reinvestment, starved for a growing tax base, starved for a population that is actually growing, not declining. And I find one of the most curious criticisms to be the idea that if land value goes up, that's somehow not helpful to a community. If you know anything about how a community functions, if it doesn't have a tax base, it's very hard to pay for services that help the most vulnerable people: schools, ambulances, fire trucks, police, etc. Where does that money come from? It doesn't appear magically. It appears from a tax base that has to be harvested from somewhere. Not to mention the fact that you have over 1 million Black and brown households in opportunity zones that are owners of their own home. And in this country, the way that we build wealth, for better or worse, is through home ownership. And so severely depressed housing markets are part of what has contributed to intergenerational lack of wealth building. And so if one early sign that we see, and we certainly do in some opportunity zone communities, is a rise in property value, that is an early indicator of market activity, of wealth building, and a very direct way of helping people in the community through direct wealth building, but also indirect means like where tax revenues go and what kind of services they provide. So no one investment should be overinterpreted as the solution, just like no one policy should be overinterpreted as the solution. This is just one of many tools in the toolkit, and we're still early. But I look very differently at some of those indicators that you mentioned as being not just acceptable, but fundamental to an overall growing picture in areas that have struggled and really been left out of the growth picture for many years.
Well, go ahead, Jimmy.
Can I add one quick thing? So
Yeah.
I think it's really important to look at what has been historically and think about the options and the toolbox as John talked about it, and to understand the importance of human dignity and the fact that small businesses need to attract investment capital. They need to be able to bank, to borrow, and we have a system that is unequal. Our banking system isn't equal. Our investment system, all the investments being skewed towards 3 states. We've got to focus on policies that can help level that playing field. And while there may be some gentrification that doesn't feel good, and I think there is bad gentrification. I think there's also good gentrification, but we have to understand what the longer term goal is, and we've got to align incentives with human flourishing. We can't incentivize the wrong behaviors. And so that's why tax policy does have to be done with thought and care, and having opportunity zones, not dissimilar, in my opinion, and I'll shut up here, but not dissimilar to having charter schools. Charter schools, are they the whole answer to our education system? No, but they have really created some competition in our education system, not dissimilar to the way opportunity zones are opening up areas that have not received investment capital to people who have money and are trying to think of, hey, where can I put my money? So but I reiterate what John said, you've got to have a long-term view, and there's no magic bullet. What we know has been going on for the past 50 years has not helped human flourishing to the extent where we go, oh, that's all we had to do. We know we still haven't solved the problem. So this is a worthy experiment, is I guess how I would put it.
Well, that's a great segue to bringing Patrick into the conversation, because Patrick is doing just that. He's bringing his money and the money of his limited partners into these communities and finding opportunities to build companies. So Patrick, take it away. What are your thoughts about how you've done it and what you've found as you've built some of these really interesting ventures in places like Baltimore and Pittsburgh?
And thanks for organizing the call today, and definitely great to get some of these updates. I'll tackle this from a practitioner's perspective. I personally, I've started 4 companies, 2 in Silicon Valley, 1 in Palo Alto, 1 in San Francisco, and 2 outside of Silicon Valley, 1 in Portland, Maine, and the other in Baltimore. I've also invested in 47 companies out of my fund, and 30 of those are outside of Silicon Valley, and deploying $100 million, billions of exits. It's really been, it's a pretty broad portfolio. And from that experience, you know, I break it down into like 4 key things. Talent, is the talent that you're looking for there? Connection, is it connected? Is it connected to a digital network? Is it office space? Is there a network there? Quality of life, is this a quality place? And then cost, is this an affordable place for you to do business? And as a practitioner, I've always start with talent. My first company outside of Silicon Valley was in Portland, Maine. And a lot of people are like, what are you thinking going to Portland? Well, there's a tremendous amount of talent in Portland. All through New England, there's talent, business process outsourcing, people who had worked in staffing agencies, call centers, customer service, who'd been left behind through e-commerce and offshoring. But that very high quality talent we were able to reorganize that talent, bring financial capital, and build a business that had 600 employees. Now, we also did this with work at home. So we're leveraging technology to change the cost structure for tapping into different types of workers. And I think this is a big theme for where we're going. You know, COVID has done a lot of bad things. One thing it has done that's good is it accelerated a lot of trends that were happening. My second company is a good example here is in Baltimore. It's a fintech company called Facet Wealth. And not a lot of people think of Baltimore as being, you know, talent rich and all this sorts of things, but it has Johns Hopkins University, which is an excellent computer science school. It also has a lot of financial services companies like Mason, Brown Advisors, T. Rowe Price are all based there. And when you think about your talent picture as an entrepreneur, you're thinking about how am I going to scale? You know, what are the talent needs that I have that I'm looking for? And you either have to move them there or they already have to be there. Which kind of brings me to the whole point of how, you know, from a policy perspective, how do we address the divide? And the good news and bad news. Well, the bad news is the divide is getting worse. I mean, this most recent election, we found that in the Joe Biden vote here was whatever, he got about 50% of the vote. He got about 500 counties out of 3,200, but it represented 70% of national GDP. These are Brookings numbers. That was up from in the last election where Hillary Clinton won about 500 counties, but it was 64% of GDP. And going back to the 2008 election, President Obama won 1,000 counties, but those 1,000 counties represented 52% of national income. So we actually have a worsening problem. We're getting a consolidation around urban rural and inside-outside economics. And so in my view, I think very, very much about how do we solve the economic problem of bringing more opportunity to more people. And let me just go back to my framework. What do we need to do? We need to keep the talent in the places where it's being grown. When people, you know, graduate from CMU University in Pittsburgh, they tend to go to Silicon Valley or Boston. We need to keep that talent in Pittsburgh. The same with talent that's graduating out of University of Michigan. It needs to stay in Detroit. It needs to stay in local communities, right? We also need to increase our connectivity because work at home, work from anywhere is a trend that is not, it's not a trend, it's actually here today. And our opportunity to connect the talented people that are all over this country through high-speed internet to the home, to tech hubs, you know, Class A office space. You can do kind of more scaled versions of office in the future. This is something that we can actually invest in that would then distribute the talent and financial capital. 2 other quick things is quality of life is becoming even more important with worker talent having the option to live in different places. So as an investor, when I'm investing in a company, say in Columbus, Ohio, my first question is it a good idea? Is the talent there? But the next question is, can they scale here? Can they raise a 10 million Series A? Can they build out 200-300 people of the talent that they need? And more with distributed work and this access to digital and with the quality of life improvements that places like Columbus are able to achieve, more companies are able to scale locally rather than you kind of get to 50, 60 people. You look around and say, all the money's in California. So now we're taking the company out of Columbus and moving to Silicon Valley. And then obviously you kind of get that compounding effect of the network in Silicon Valley. And Columbus, in this case, loses out on the, you know, the kind of, what do you call like that next level of advantages. So I'll pause there, but I'm actually both concerned and all quite optimistic. The Opportunity Zones program, to me, when John brought it to me and said, hey, what do you think about this? I said, my biggest question is, where's the big check going to come from? Because many times it gets stuck in kind of the coastal communities that have deep networks. And this incentive really does make you think, why not put my money in an opportunity zone? Why not put a company in a place that's historically distressed? Now I have this 10-year advantage of keeping the money there, parking it, and then positive ecosystems can build up around it, the stability of a long-term investment. And we can talk later about the work I've done with our Opportunity Zone Fund, but we're seeing a tremendous amount of really great projects that would not otherwise have been funded.
Great. And that's a good time to bring Hadley. And so Hadley, tell us about some of this work that you've been doing and your team has been doing on family leave. It's been an area that was discussed quite a bit in the Trump term. Didn't actually get anywhere, but I think there's been certainly a furtherance of the debate around family leave. To what degree are women right now able to take advantage of these time-consuming jobs at an age or at a time when they're having children and families are having children, and therefore that's at least historically as that burden has fell on women. Tell us about that. What that's like, where the disparities are, and what are some of the best ideas that you've encountered to try to address that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really fascinating issue. And I think it fits nicely with this theme of the rise of the rest, or ensuring equal opportunity, not just for women, but certainly for people who are at the lower end of the income scale, because those are workers that we know are less likely to be in jobs that offer some type of paid family leave benefit and employer-sponsored benefit. So it's a fascinating issue politically too. I just served on a task force last year in the state of Colorado as we were sort of brainstorming what to do here at the state level. You're right that there are some policy innovations at the federal level that are really exciting, and I want to talk about those more specifically. But first, I'll just say my personal approach to this issue. I've worked for Independent Women's Forum for about 10 years now. We believe all issues are women's issues, but certainly there are certain workplace issues that impact women and men differently, whether we're talking about pay equity or family leave policy or childcare policy, or to touch on something Patrick just said, workplace flexibility and the ability to work from home and the gifts that technology have to offer women, certainly women in particular types of jobs where remote work is feasible. But I drive by a gas station a lot on the way home to my house, and there frequently is a hiring sign in front of the gas station. And although my work is in public policy, I just do this personal thought experiment. If I were to lose everything, even my college education, and if I wanted to take that job, minimum wage job at the gas station, could I work my way back in this country to a place of financial security and comfort? And that was something that I used to ask myself and think, well, I don't know, maybe, I hope so. But now that I have two young children, age 4 and 2, you may actually see them in the background. That's the downside of having glass doors to my home office. They are with a babysitter, I should add. Now that I have two young children, that question becomes a lot more complicated for me. Certainly if I didn't have a partner or a husband to contribute to household income, the idea of working as a single mom in a low-wage job, and the idea of trying to build wealth or have a socially mobile career, I think is much more intimidating. And I think it's a harder question to answer. So one thing that we want to work towards at Independent Women's Forum is making that a possible reality for people. And when it comes to paid family leave, I already mentioned that people at the low end of the income spectrum are less likely to have access to those benefits at work, but they're also in a inferior position when it comes to savings, right? So even if you're an upper income family who doesn't have paid family leave, you can put aside some resources for a rainy day, and perhaps you have some unpaid leave. Maybe this is something your employer offers voluntarily, or maybe they're subject to FMLA, which is a 1993 law that guarantees job protection for 12 weeks. But we don't have any federal laws in this country that guaranteed any paid leave. There's no mandate on employers to provide paid leave, and there's no what we call pay replacement program at the federal level. There are about 9 or 10 states that have a pay replacement program. And again, I'll talk more policy specific in a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about the politics of the issue, because when I came to this task force in Colorado last year, sort of what I learned is that typically on the left, politically, this issue is treated sort of like a gender equity issue, but also like a labor issue. It's a workers' rights issue, right? Just like minimum wage or requiring, for example, employers to offer health insurance benefits. I mean, it's very similar to some of those policy approaches. And then on the right recently, in large part due to President Trump or Ivanka Trump's leadership on this issue, but also because I think of an increased interest among sort of cultural conservatives in the issue of family leave. They're concerned about fertility rates. They're concerned about maybe pro-life issues or support for family wholeness and family units. We're starting to see more interest from Republicans and people on the right side of politics, which makes, I think, for fertile ground policy-wise to start talking about some innovations. But what we have in terms of the actual proposed bills in front of us, we have, I think, sort of the old existing approach, which is a bill that has never passed at the federal level called the Family Act. And Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York has been the sponsor for the last several, iterations of the bill. It is a new entitlement that would function basically with a new payroll tax on all workers and would fund a new government office that would distribute pay replacement for anyone who has a medical or family related leave from work. And there's a progressive formula for how those benefits would work, meaning that if you're a higher income person, you get a lower portion of your wages replaced. And if you're a lower income person, you get a higher rate of your income replaced while you're out on paid family leave. But more recently, we've seen some bills introduced by Republicans. And one of those is actually the result of policy work that we did at Independent Women's Forum. And this is the brainchild of IWF fellow Kristen Shapiro. So she deserves the credit for this sort of innovative idea where rather than creating a new benefit, it's a restructuring of existing benefits where people who qualify could opt to delay their Social Security retirement benefits in exchange for an immediate parental benefit after the birth or adoption of a new child. And this would serve as a wage replacement, similar to what the Family Act offers, but based instead on the Social Security disability insurance formula. And so this way you have a budget neutral plan that's also has the benefit of being voluntary. So rather than a required tax that everyone has to participate in, this only costs you if you opt into the program. And if structured correctly, if designed correctly, it could, it could be budget neutral in a way that would not be harmful to the long-term financial picture for the Social Security program, which I know is a concern for a lot of people. So that's one bill, and there's also another bill that's now under consideration in both houses of Congress, which would work very similar to the Social Security earned leave plan, and this other plan would allow people to essentially borrow ahead on their child tax credits. And if you go to the Independent Women's Forum website, we have a great chart that sort of compares and contrasts these different approaches. So the New Parents Act, which mirrors our Social Security earned leave plan, is sponsored by Rubio and Romney in the Senate, by Wagner and Crenshaw in the House. And the Child Tax Credit Plan is sponsored by Senators Cassidy and Sinema. So it does have bipartisan support in the Senate, and then in the House of Representatives, Representatives Stefanik and Allred, and other Democrats and Republicans. It's got many co-sponsors. This would essentially allow people to borrow ahead on their child tax credit. Now, there's an important caveat here, and that is that some of the plans that I've just discussed about borrowing ahead on your Social Security or borrowing ahead on a child tax credit only apply to family leave or parental leave. They don't apply to, say, like a medical emergency or medical leave, which is sort of a separate issue, but also can be an emergency for people when they don't have wage replacement at work. So I would just say those are some of the bills that are currently under consideration. And what I've learned is you have to consider a lot of implications when you're talking about paid family leave, because to sort of touch on something that Jimmy mentioned earlier, at the heart of this issue, it's a very interesting but sometimes difficult issue, because we're essentially talking about a subsidy either from an employer or from the government for non-work, because when you're not at work after the birth of a new child, that's foregone productivity for your employer, for the economy, and so forth. However, speaking as a mother, I've been through a couple maternity leaves. I don't mean to imply that you're not working while you're on maternity leave. That's some of the hardest work you'll ever do, and some of the most sleepless work you'll ever do. It's very important. So I think we just have to ask, what are the implications in terms of families in the US, particularly when we know that so many families operate paycheck to paycheck, even with two earners. And certainly when it comes to single head of household families, it's very difficult to save ahead or prepare for a rainy day. So the question becomes, can we restructure some benefits to prevent people who are really on the brink of poverty? Because about half of people earning under $30,000 a year end up seeking government assistance after the birth of a child anyway. So the question is, can we do something to prevent people from entering poverty during a big transition in their life, keep them attached to the labor force, help them to stay self-sufficient, and do so in a way that's really helpful to strong families, family formation, child welfare, maternal welfare, and so forth, but do it in a way that doesn't come with some of the downsides of a universal new entitlement. And I could talk a lot longer, but I sense I should wrap up. And wrap up, I should say, this is one issue that is, I think, in an exciting area of policy related to family policy, including childcare and workplace flexibility, that I hope with some of the political realignment that's going on right now, we can see some really exciting opportunities.
You're right, Hadley, that we could easily spend a whole hour on this topic. So I appreciate you condensing it for us. One question we got from the audience that relates to something you said. You talked about how the work from home acceleration has been helpful to a lot of women. The flip side is that women have disproportionately been the ones who've lost jobs during the pandemic. Are there things that you think about in terms of how we emerge from the pandemic that we have to think about that are related to that disproportionate job loss?
Yeah, so we still have pretty strong, certain industries, certainly we've seen a lot more gender equality in terms of the number of, for example, the number of doctors and lawyers has been becoming slowly more equal in terms of women entering those, traditionally male-dominated fields. But we still have a lot of fields in this country that are heavily dominated by one sex or the other. And the reality is that a lot of more, the social sector, the areas where we're doing caregiving, we're doing teaching, we're providing services directly face-to-face, women do a lot of those jobs. And so that's the trouble. When you have a pandemic, a public health emergency, and you can't do the face-to-face work of, cutting hair or providing childcare or teaching in a school setting, that has huge implications for women. And so ultimately, I think the way we come out of this pandemic is that we make it possible for women to do those jobs where they're, physically in contact with the people that they're serving, because women do dominate a lot of service-oriented industries. And, I know that FREOPP has put together some really great plans for how to mitigate sort of the pandemic in the meantime. But, certainly my hope is that one day we can feel like it's safe to do those jobs again.
Patrick, question for you. You mentioned taking advantage of the Carnegie Mellons and the Johns Hopkins and the talent pools around those universities. What about the parts of the country where those universities aren't there as an anchor? Is it possible that as one builds a company and an ecosystem, that local talent pool that doesn't have the advantage of a university can benefit from that? Or walk us through that. So how do you think about if you were to build a company in a place that didn't have a top tier university, what would be some of the considerations that you'd want to think about as an investor or an entrepreneur?
Well, as an investor, you really are thinking about what the talent strategy is. And many times the university is kind of that evergreen source of new grads. So you need to think through what other types of things. So this is where I think like quality of life and amenities, like if the talent is not there, it is really hard. If there's not fertile ground, it's really hard to grow things, right? And so when I think about places like Bend, Oregon or Bozeman, Montana, both have some universities, obviously, but they really do lean on their amenities to attract really high quality talent that want to live there and then build community. And as you kind of get smaller companies becoming bigger companies, the place itself becomes an attraction. And so that is a real advantage. Now, I think a more scalable way to look at this is to look at regional hubs. So we talked about Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania and kind of Northwestern Ohio, sitting between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, there's something like 8 million people or something like that in between those two regions. It's about maybe a 2.5 hour drive between those two large areas. there are a lot of people who could be kind of part of the ecosystems that are kind of driven by those regional hubs. So the Pittsburghs and the Clevelands, those two together could become kind of the REITs, so to speak, that people in the Youngstowns and the Warrens and other places in the community where maybe they're now commuting to, once a week or twice a week, or they go in for training or they go in for some session, but then they work from home. So I think the work from anywhere is vital. And Hadley, your issue, you're highlighting the impact for women is absolutely crucial because of the flexibility around it in general, whether we have a pandemic or not. But it's also just for every worker. The fact that you no longer have to leave your family for a great career. There is a 4-to-1 ratio of tech worker to service worker. So for every tech job that a community can attract or retain, you're going to get 4 service jobs. And so if you start thinking about places more regionally, right now we say we have 80% of the venture in 3 states. It's actually 65% is just in the Bay Area, right? So it's even more skewed. If you start expanding that capital, both financial capital and human capital, to other regional places, I think that's where you kind of get the rings around those hubs that can benefit from both the investment capital, but most importantly, is something I'll put on the table. This is a think tank organization, is to think about the networks, right? So every network is as strong as the number of nodes and the quality of the connections between the nodes. That's just systems theory, right? And so when we can stand up an Austin, a Salt Lake, a Pittsburgh, a Columbus, and then interconnect those through work. So Silicon Valley company opening offices or having remote workers in these places, they're creating a network between these spatial locations. But then within those locations, you get a local network that then is a service network, it's a onboarding education, then you get a recruiting network, right? And so I really think that, if you take this up a notch and we think about how do we change the future for more people in more places, we need to think about improving the network. How do we connect more places? And then invest in the quality of the connection between those places. And I think there's a lot we can do on a policy perspective, but we need to acknowledge that the work from anywhere, that's a starting point. But then how do we make it more equal? So somebody who's in a rural place has the same bandwidth, has a computer that can stand them up, has access to the recruiting talent, has a different way of explaining what their work experience. We were recruiting some people in Madison, Wisconsin. Everybody thinks about Madison is pretty nice with the university, but this is more of an administrative jobs. And it's like, how do we explain to somebody what Badger Financial, somebody who worked in a local bank versus worked in finance at eBay or Google or something like that? We just need to think more holistically about how we interpret the skills that people have, even once we onboard them. So Avik, I would say that the most important thing we can think through here is building these networks and investing in the interconnection between them.
Great. John, or anyone actually, but John, since I know this is something that's interesting to you, how do you think about this challenge of the places that don't have a Hopkins or a Carnegie Mellon? Are community colleges and vocational institutions, can they fill in some of those gaps, or what's the right way to think about the talent pool in opportunity zones or other underserved areas?
Well, every community has to leverage its advantages, and every community has different assets with which to make a case. And so with opportunity zones as a policy doesn't circumvent the need for communities to have a strategy, to have their local stakeholders and anchor institutions pulling in the right direction and coordinating together. What we find in a lot of places around the country is that communities are punching below their weight. They don't have an intentional strategy that really in a clear-eyed way assesses what are our vulnerabilities, what do we need to be doing now in order to plan ahead and compensate for whatever those challenges are. I grew up in the upstate of South Carolina, so I like to use this as an example, where today you'll find BMW and Michelin production and a lot of high tech and high-end manufacturing. 30, 40 years ago, you saw agriculture and textiles. And if you know anything about those industries, even at the time, you could tell those were industries that were going away. And that was certainly not going to be the driver of American economic growth in the 21st century. Leaders back then, I'm talking about the 80s, in early 90s, they anticipated those challenges. They started to make plans to shift the industrial focus of their community and to pour a lot of resources and a lot of coordination into reimagining what that upstate economy could be. And today it's just an absolute marvel. And if you were time traveling between the two periods, you would not recognize that area at all. So the past does not need to be prologue, I think, is the story that we should take away from that. The communities can reinvent themselves, they can leverage what assets they have, but it's not going to happen by accident, almost never happens by accident. It doesn't happen in spite of a lack of strategy, it happens because of a strategy, and opportunity zones can be fuel in that direction. But I think that's one of the, I would say, the biggest misconceptions about any federal intervention, any policy intervention whatsoever, is people think that there's something that automatically is going to happen just because we have a policy or a designation called opportunity zones or whatever it may be. Nothing is guaranteed. These are not called guarantee zones. And so people need to treat that accordingly. They need to act as if this is something, communities in particular need to act as if this is something to work towards. And even with the best efforts, it's not going to work everywhere. So how do you leverage your assets? And again, in the places that we've seen the most early success, it has come as a direct result of cross-sector coordination, direct engagement from anchor institutions, large employers, leadership at the local and state level. Those things working together are what drive the big results and ultimately what drive transformative, durable results. It's Patrick's right, where you have a platinum asset like Carnegie Mellon, if you're not using that, it's malpractice. But there are plenty of other assets that communities can leverage and often don't, just for lack of intentionality.
I just put a circle around that legacy asset question, because that is something I'm always asking when I'm looking at investment. I said, why this? Like, why is this idea? Like, why now? Because you need a catalyst for action, right? Why you? Why are you the right team? And the last one is why here? Because I do so much. Like, why is this place? And it's not because I don't want to move to California. There has to be some legacy asset that you're leveraging, whether it's university, a legacy skill group, like I was talking about up in Portland, Maine. That's an example of a place that doesn't have a university, but has high quality of life, and enough people live within an hour and a half of Portland that you can attract that talented people. I was going to say, Kentucky is a really interesting example of success, particularly under the pandemic. They have a long history of logistics in Kentucky, and if you look at the unemployment rate in Kentucky, Louisville especially, it's actually been very low, less than 5%. Even in the face of high unemployment in the rest of the country, there's a legacy asset of transportation, skill, quality. There was already logistics, Amazon was there, UPS was there, and they've actually been leveraging that in the face of this emergency to contribute to the economy. So the legacy assets are where you have to start.
Avik?
Yeah.
So I wanted to build on a point that Patrick made earlier about network, and John was talking about also that communities have got to bring what they have to the table. And I think you mentioned it, Avik. Yes, we've got to fix workforce development. I've got a man who we work with at the Jack Kemp Foundation named Raymond Bell, has Project Hope. Raymond grew up in Southeast DC. He's about my age, 50 years old. And Raymond figured out that there's a huge need and demand from the government contractors, the Beltway bandits who have these IT firms, and they need qualified, certified technology experts. And he looked at it, he said, oh my goodness, I can train people and you don't need a college degree. And so Raymond created Project Hope, and he's gotten technical and technical certifications and government clearances for predominantly African-American kids from Ward 8 in Southeast DC. And he's gotten about 3,000 kids jobs. And these are jobs that are paying $50,000, $60,000 a year. So here's actually the thing that most frustrates me though. He has been getting paid for his work by a DC government program. I want him to turn into a business, and he can he can build this out across the country, franchise it, whatever, have some way to monetize it. He owns the equity. He has an investor who comes in. He's in an opportunity zone. And that's the kind of longer term thinking that does multiple things at once, helps Raymond build wealth off the phenomenal investment that he's made, but also help these young people get jobs that they didn't think they have access to, and more should be exposed to that. But that's an example of how workforce development has to be fixed, and he hates dealing with the city government. He'd much rather deal with an investor, and he'd much rather deliver returns on that investment than have to answer questions from the city government about how he's doing it. But those are the types of things that have to come from communities, and it's stories of where people are already doing the work in these communities. But I'm trying to help him raise an opportunity zone capital for his business to flourish and have him get off of government program revenue.
As a reminder, you can ask us a question at #Agenda2025 on Twitter, or use the Q&A box here on Zoom. Here's a question from David Johnson, and maybe I'll direct this to John, but anyone else pipe in if you've got a thought on it. What's the right way to measure success for opportunity zones? I mean, obviously it's easy to quantify the amount of capital that's going in, the input, but how do we measure the outcomes?
Well, this question actually gets to one of the big policy failures associated with opportunity zones, which is the lack of transparency and reporting requirements that were always intended to be a part of the legislation, but were stripped out for parliamentary reasons, were dropped as part of the budget reconciliation process that passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and haven't been restored since then. So the short answer is we won't be able to measure in any kind of meaningful and comprehensive way without Congress taking that next step, which I should note it could take today. If it wanted to, there's bipartisan legislation that could pass quite easily. So that would be, I'd be remiss if I didn't make that point to start. But in the grand scheme of things, as I mentioned at the outset, this is a long-term policy. So you're not going to see overnight turnaround. But the kind of things that I would want to measure over time include what were the reasons that these were designated in the first place? Low income, high poverty. So over time, you want to see that the cohort of places that were chosen to be opportunity zones start to, as a group, improve on measures that outpace the places that were eligible but not chosen. So you have an experiment here where within a group of places that were low-income communities as designated by Treasury, some were chosen, some were not. And the ones that were chosen were actually higher poverty, lower income, higher distress across every measure that you can think of than the places that were eligible and not chosen by governors. So here you have a nice experiment to say, if over time they swap positions and the places that were chosen as opportunity zones end up outpacing the places that were not chosen, that would be one really important way to measure the longer term effects. But we want to look at poverty, we want to look at income, we want to look at new business starts. We want to try to quantify follow-on investment, because opportunity zone investment may be just the tip of the spear for a much broader array of investment that comes in on the heels of that momentum. And we hear about this all the time, by the way, that investors end up making an investment that's not qualifying as an opportunity zone investment, but they made it because they were drawn in out of curiosity or some kind of connection to a community because it was an opportunity zone designation. So as a research organization, we look at this question pretty holistically. We want to see across a wide array of economic indicators and social indicators that, compared to their previous trajectory, the communities that were chosen have a meaningful boost across a wide array of socioeconomic measures. And we want to compare those communities to places that were similarly situated before the designation, but not chosen to be opportunity zones. So that's a very wonky way of saying how we would tackle this. And we hope this is a major area of research. But for it to really become all it should be, this is one major piece of unfinished business that Congress and the administration should close out by giving Treasury the mandate to really do more data collection.
I wasn't aware of that. That's really interesting.
I think somebody should
about
invest in FREOPP and have you guys do all the research on the success of opportunity zones.
Well, if John doesn't have the market cornered, we're more than happy to chip in where we can be useful, for sure. But yeah, this point about the thing that was chopped out because of reconciliation, that's very interesting. I'm definitely gonna take a look at that. That could be interesting. Well, listen, we've got about 6 minutes left in our hour. Maybe I can open it up to other topics that we've neglected here. Is there anything that you want to bring up that's related to this topic? Any of you that we haven't already addressed?
I just want to hit on the education really quickly. I think to focus on these communities, and the question was asked, how can these communities maximize the positive policy incentives of opportunity zones? Well, I think we've got to use COVID and the reality of people learning from home. And doesn't your heart go out to all the parents and young children who have to have their young children interacting with teachers on a screen? Just, oh, it's so painful. My kids are older and it stinks. But we've got to rethink education and acknowledge what hasn't and what isn't now working. Big school districts, they can't adapt on the fly in a situation like this. So we've got to bring free enterprise, free market solutions to bear. And we have to do a much better job explaining why that is the most compassionate, effective, efficient use of resources, as opposed to having the government solve everything. Let's have policies that help government do what they do, but then put power down in the local places where people should be making decisions. And on the family leave part, anything that incentivizes parents to be good parents, including in education, having parents make choices for their own children's education, those are the types of incentives that policy should be targeting. So Hadley, the argument that subsidizing non-work of parents, there's and John Mueller is an example of somebody who's done a ton of research of why that we're not worried about new moms or new dads being at home with their children, because that actually helps their production and flourishing when they see how much work a child is. But I would just, education, getting tax policy right, having these incentives in place. I think family leave is an important discussion, and workforce development is critical and it goes along with education, because we can't think that A, everybody learns similarly, or B, everybody has the same aptitudes. We have a vast range of aptitudes and we need it. So those are kind of the big picture things that I applaud you for thinking about and being willing to delve into, and all of your sessions so far have been great and covered a bunch of important areas like this.
Let me put a big circle around, Jimmy, the point you're making about talent. I think that talent to me is like, it's the coin of the realm. It's the natural, it's like it's the fisheries of the past, or the coal mines of the past. Is like knowledge workers is the future economy. And I want to just highlight that for anybody who's thinking who's in economic development, is that your city, it's jump ball right now for talent. You have the chance right now to go and attract, through your amenities, through schooling, housing, all the different things that make your community attractive. Talent can move today. Twitter said 100% of their workers can work from home. Facebook said 50% of their workers can work from home. Stripe, all these companies with amazingly talented people who are not only smart, they make a lot of money, but they're also huge impacts for your local communities as mentors in your schools, tax, all these things. And so right now, cities need to be thinking about, how do you make the case for knowledge workers to come to your community? And I think that's really critical. And also, if you're generating talent, like in your schools and your universities, how do you retain them? Retain your talent, because this is what the future economy is going to be built on. And if you're a company, you really need to be rethinking your talent strategies, because not everybody has to move to the Bay Area. It will both be better for your bottom line because you're going to pay less, but it's a higher quality job to the person you're hiring, because 30% less money in most places around the country creates a twice as good a quality of life. And so retention will be higher. You're going to access to more talented people. So this idea of talent strategy, I think, is the most fundamental thing we should be focused on right now if we're going to address the economic divide.
Can I add a couple things, Avik, just because
Yes, please,
there's some
Hadley.
really similar, there's just a lot of threads that run through all of these policy areas when we're talking about social mobility. And, certainly when I say family leave as a subsidy for non-work, I just mean to stress that that's why program design is important, right? Because we want to, as with all things anti-poverty, we want to ensure that we're helping those who truly, need some temporary assistance without creating a safety net that becomes more like a hammock or becomes something that's open to abuse, right? So that's why we have to be really careful with program design. But to sort of touch on this theme of talent and knowledge, and the reason that I have paid maternity leave benefits through my employer, and many women and men do, and we saw a huge expansion of this when we saw the economic expansion that preceded the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's something that employers want to offer, and if they have more resources, they will offer it. And often the family leave that employers can offer is more customizable and even more generous than what we see in some of these government-based proposals. But I'll just say the reason employers have a greater incentive to offer these benefits to workers who have education and knowledge is that because it's harder to replace me, right? It's harder to replace white collar women. It's harder to replace people who have education and skills that are relevant to the job. If you're in a low wage, low skilled job, you're easier to replace. And so there's less incentive for employers to offer that. So if we can move more women and men into the category of worker that is harder to replace and where they are applying skills and education to a particular job, that has enormous benefits around, just around their life and around their welfare. But it also means that they're more likely to have this benefit. And then finally, I heard John talking a lot about how to measure the success of opportunity zones. I think this is also an important question in family leave policy, or really any entitlement or family related policy. How do we measure success? And sometimes we talk about, labor force participation. You can increase labor force participation, especially among women, if you have a more generous family leave policy. But we've also seen evidence that sometimes more generous family leave policies are associated with wider gender wage gaps. So women tend to get sort of stuck on the first floor because employers make generalizations about women are more likely to take family leave when it's available even to both sexes. So we have to be careful not to violate the gender equity that we're aiming for. And we also want to keep an eye towards, I think the ultimate measure of success is, are people satisfied? Are people sort of charting their own course in life? Are they achieving what their personal definition of the American dream is? And even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a lot of women who are full-time in the workforce saying that their preference would be for part-time work. I imagine because if they're mothers, they want to spend more time with their families. This is something where we see like an interesting difference between the sexes in surveys. Working moms want to work less generally, and working dads want to work more. They want to maximize their income, presumably to provide for the children, right? And for their family. So I think if we're looking at labor force participation as the sole metric of whether family leave policy is successful or not, that's not the best. It's not the only metric, right? We have to think about, are people really satisfied? And certainly with COVID-19, I think there's probably more women in the category of, I've lost my job, or I wish I could work more. I'm going crazy stuck in this house with these kids who can't go to school, so we've probably swung the pendulum to the opposite end of the spectrum. But I think it's really hard to measure, are people satisfied with their lives? But that's a question that can be best answered in myriad private arrangements. And the question is, can we foster the sort of economic environment that is conducive to that, that's conducive to private sector employers being, leading actors in terms of offering benefits that support families. So that's a lot. I was sort of saving my notes from other things the panelists has said, but that was fascinating how these issues all have, overlap.
Well, that's why we wanted to bring the four of you together, and a lot of food for thought, a lot of threads to unspool here, and we'll have to leave that for further discussions because we are out of time. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Tomorrow, we'll be back at the same time, same URL, our URL link, with our panel on, is big tech still a force for progress, with venture capitalists Joe Lonsdale and Sal Churi, Evan Baer, a former senior executive at Facebook, and biotech entrepreneur Avik Ramaswamy. You won't want to miss it. And we're going to be going same time, same place, Tuesday through Friday this week and Tuesday through Friday next week. You can see the whole schedule at agenda.freopp.org. Thanks again, Jimmy, John, Hadley, Patrick. Really appreciate you sparing the time today.
Thanks all. Bye.